Imagine for a moment you are sitting in the pew in that Corinthian congregation. All of your fellow congregants are there with you. And Paul, the great apostle Paul, is talking to you. You know he is in chains, in prison, 1,000 miles away in Rome. Someone in the congregation is reading the letter just received. At first, everyone is excited. We've got mail. But the whole congregation is silent because it has just been taken to task by someone whom they love very dearly. Paul is not letting them get away with how things have taken a turn for the worse in this congregation that he planted. He has just leveled with them about the people in the congregation who are denying the resurrection of the body. He has pleaded with them that in giving up this teaching, they are really giving up the very center of what he had been bringing them when he lived with them for 2 years. His preaching is in vain. Everything he labored for is in vain. It makes them, the apostles, out to be liars, that they made Christ out to be alive when he wasn't. And last of all, if it is true what they are thinking, they are still in their sins. Paul then encourages them lovingly as a dear father as to what to do with their uncertainties and doubts. We discussed this. Look back in the scriptures, my friends. Immerse yourself amidst your doubt there. See how all these things were talked about in the prophets. Hear the words that I'm quoting to you from the Old Testament. Let God move your heart through his word away from your doubt. Second, Paul told them, get back to the ABCs, the basics. Don't be so wise, you Corinthians, always thinking that you are so spiritual. Actually, he says, you have become fools. Finally, he asks them to listen to the witnesses of the Holy Spirit, the people in the past they know and love, who testified about the risen Lord. He lists Peter, who was the Lord's right-hand man, James, brother of our Lord, and leader of the church at Jerusalem, who himself at first did not believe. And then he mentions himself, the one untimely born who had the vision on the road to Damascus. I didn't believe either until I saw the risen Lord then. Remember, too, he says, those 500 brothers and the rest of the apostles, many of whom you can still talk to. These Corinthians were doubting even though they had firsthand experience with eyewitnesses who themselves had touched Jesus and had heard him and seen him. After speaking to them, Paul tenderly then continues by explaining their faith and life experience to them in graspable ways. This was last week's lesson. They had some questions. Why do we experience death? And why is this life so full of sin and suffering if Jesus is risen from the dead? Well, because we are all in line with Adam, and we've participated in his sin. We bear his same flesh. We deal with this sin. How is it possible that we benefit by what Christ did, they wonder? Well, we certainly benefited negatively by what Adam did and participated in his death. As death came through one man, Paul says, it is hard to believe that life came from one man too. You believe and accept the one. Why is it so hard to not believe the other? But they say, why aren't things better in our lives, and why are things taking so long if Jesus is risen from the dead? And Paul then turned to the image of the fruit. You see fruit, don't you? One or a few come before the whole crop. There's always a first one to be ripe. That is Jesus. He's the first fruit from the dead, but the completion is yet to come. But why? Why do we wait so long? Well, there's more work to do, the Apostle Paul says. The harvest has started, but Jesus ascended on high has yet to complete all the work. The battle continues until all things are put under his feet, and the last enemy is death, and then the end will come. Jesus has more work to do until death is subdued. The last enemy is defeated. We live now in that time where Jesus is finishing up his work. Paul then talked in the last section that we spoke of last week about the ethics of the resurrection. This was the most interesting section to me because it asks the question, how does the resurrection of Jesus change you and the way that you live? How does it change the way we live as Christians? Well, life has meaning because of the resurrection, Paul says. We have hope that we will see the dead. It's why we live. It's why we struggle. It's why we continue to fight. We will appear before the judgment seat of Christ in our bodies. It's why I'm willing, Paul says, to suffer for you. It's why I boast in you to others. How proud I am of you. And finally, Paul in chains looks at them through his letter and says, you know, folks, life without the resurrection is just plain old meaningless. All that life becomes is getting excited about your next meal, what you will drink with your supper, and looking for the next exciting day in the calendar. Is that really it? See your crucified and risen Lord. See what he has done for you. Now, in this next part, seemingly confusing, Paul keeps on speaking to the Corinthian congregation. He speaks to the next objection that he is hearing. So turn back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 there, and we'll turn to verse 35. RJ, would you, I know you have a different version there, but would you read verse 35?
Someone may ask, how are the dead raised? What kind of body will they come?
Okay, you should probably read that kind of scoffing a little bit because this was the way they were speaking in that congregation. Someone here, in your own words, what is the objection that is being whispered in the back pews of the congregation as people converse together in the Christian congregation about Paul's teaching of the resurrection of the body or about this teaching? Why are they thinking that Paul's teaching on the resurrection is ridiculous? And remember, they did in that culture and time period believe in kind of a shadowy existence of the afterlife after they died. What are they getting at with these objections? So RJ read it. I'll read it again here. What are they getting at? How are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You can't understand the rest if you don't understand what their objection is. Any thoughts?
Will it be a body as we see it now? Will it be a heavenly body?
If you understand that they're scoffing a bit when they're asking these questions, they're snickering a little bit, what do they think is preposterous or ridiculous?
Some just don't even think resurrection's going to happen.
Yeah, so they think they're just kind of saying what? What kind of body are we, this is just ridiculous. What kind of body will we be? Like, how can God do this? This is absolutely what? What kind of body are we going to have there, Apostle Paul? Okay? That's kind of their response to Paul's preaching on the resurrection. They're giving an objection and basically saying, this is simply ridiculous. Okay, it's the best I can do on that, but I think once we understand that, we can understand the next part, which probably was really confusing to you as we read it. Paul uses two analogies to answer their objections. What are they? Look at verse 37 and verse 39. What are the analogies that he uses? The first analogy and then the second analogy. And you can just use one word possibly to say these or to speak of these pictures. He uses a word picture, analogy, a kind of a story you might say, or an idea. What's the first analogy? The analogy of the seed, okay? The analogy of the seed, and what's the second analogy? Yeah, a flesh or a body. We'll call it a body. You can use the word flesh or body, but he uses this word body to describe different things, okay? Okay. Confusing, but let me explain very briefly. Back up here. Paul is basically saying this. O foolish Corinthians. And by foolish, what that word means is that their lives have become lives that are disconnected from God and His Word. That's what it means to be a fool, right? Psalm 2, the fool has said in his heart what? There is no God. That's what it means to be foolish, to be without what? God and His truth. O foolish Corinthians, you all understand how seeds work, but you can't grasp how the resurrection works, how stupid you have become. You understand the one thing, but you cannot see the second thing. Corinthians, look at a what? Look at a seed. Now, this is me talking here for a moment. When I lived in Wisconsin, I did a fair bit of planting. Each year, I would plant my seeds, my plants from scratch. The thing I noticed is the seeds are all different. What was amazing to me as I planted those things, the seeds into the little packets, was a differentiation in the seeds. Some of the seeds, imagine this. You need imagination for the Scriptures. The devil is about a lack of imagination. Some of the seeds were large and flat and fat. Then you have the small seeds that are almost lost in your hands. Big seeds and medium-sized seeds. Long and spindly seeds. Smooth seeds. Rough seeds. Delicate seeds, almost would break in your hands. Round seeds that are fun to roll in your fingers, like the mustard seeds you sometimes get. Now, if you were a kind of seed, what kind of seed would you be? Now, in my mind, as I was writing these thoughts down, I heard R.J. saying, "Well, Pastor, I'm kind of a large guy. I think I'm one of those pumpkin seeds." The first point Paul is making in his statement in verse 26, go back to verse 26. I think I don't have that right. 36. You foolish person, let's read that together. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. Now just pause. The first point Paul is making is this. Seeds have to what? Decay and die before they what? Become alive. So why is it so hard to see that we will become alive after we die? If it happens to seeds, why can't we imagine that it can also happen to what? To us. And God holds our remains in His hand, even as a plant decays and dies and goes to the ground, and yet the seed is still there. Second point is this. I think this is profound. Our lives here are rather like those seeds. Your life here. They're rather dull. They're rather brown. They're rather gray. They're differentiated, but still, they're just like seeds. What we shall be is not seen. Just like a seed. While we think of our lives as wonderful and amazing here on this earth, it is almost like we are not even seeing in color. We're seeing the seeds, but not the packet on the front side. What we will be is akin to looking at a seed packet, seeing the picture on the outside of the sleeve, and looking in and saying, "Say what?" We'll talk more about this next week. So these are the 2 points. And the theologians say this paragraph, this idea like this. This is what they say: continuity and transformation, or continuity and discontinuity, but I like the other word better. Continuity and transformation. In other words, continuity. Our old self, still what? Still us, still RJ, still Christopher, still of the same substance, yet transformation, different, alive like we have never been before. More on that next week. Not subject to decay. Remember Jesus. Jesus was the same Jesus, the same Lord. He was not a ghost. Ghosts don't have flesh and blood as you see that I have. Jesus was the same Jesus, yet Jesus was also what? Different, not subject to decay. He passed through doors, never again to die. As an aside, Lazarus comes out with his what? Grave clothes. There was the same Lazarus, but it wasn't the transformation yet. Jesus, what about his grave clothes? Okay? So the sense in which all of the resurrections in the Bible are half of what will be. Lazarus went back to his former existence, and yet in our resurrection, we are transformed. Finally, Paul asks us to look around. And this is the second thing that you didn't understand and I didn't understand when Paul's going all around the universe. You got to use your imagination. Paul's appealing to it. Look around and see the amazing creation God has made. Look at a sea star on the ocean floor. I'm thinking about the trip to the ocean we'll make this summer. Imagine the sea turtle swimming in the ocean. The flippers there. Some of them 9 feet large. Look at an athlete, a human body swimming in the ocean, breathing deep breaths and going for miles. Look at a deer on the side of the ocean, a stag still and majestic. Then a beautiful doe with her fawns with the spots so pretty. Look at the moon and its light. Look at the glory of the sun, its sunshine on a morning day when its bright rays pierce the gloom of light. Look at the stars and the constellations on a dark night as they reach out to you, and as you feel you could reach out and almost touch them. Do you see God's creation? Do you see the bodies that God has made, all different, all full of glory, and yet all different in their glory? Paul concludes, so many bodies, so many glories. You see it here, foolish ones. Why can't you believe how glorious and different it will be? Tonight I want to close with a quote from Martin Luther. It's a little bit long, but he's preaching also to his saints, just as Paul was preaching to the saints gathered there in Corinth. So Martin Luther was preaching on this very text to his saints at Wittenberg, encouraging them to believe in the resurrection. Hear his words based on 1 Corinthians 15, this very section. Martin Luther writes, "When you, Wittenbergers, see a peasant or husbandman walking along on his field, reaching into his sack, then scattering and strewing something about him, you have a beautiful picture. You have a painting of God's method of resurrecting the dead. You can imagine and think of God as such a peasant and you yourself as a small kernel which he casts into the ground, so that it may become forth much more beautiful and glorious. But God is a much better and greater husbandman than a peasant in his field. He has a sack about his neck filled with seed. We human beings are that seed, as many of us as came into the world, beginning with Adam and extending to the last day. These seeds God strews about him into the soil as he takes them into his hand, woman, man, large, small, young, and old. For one, it's the same as another to him, and the whole world is no more than the cloth bag suspended from the peasant's neck. Therefore, when God has people die, especially in great numbers by pestilence, war, or otherwise, he is reaching into the sack and strewing a handful of seeds about him. Well, what does a pious peasant or husbandman do and think when he scatters his seed about like that? It looks like futile labor. It looks like loss. And he appears to be a fool who wantonly squanders his grain. But ask him, and he will be quick to tell you, "Why, my dear man, I'm not casting it away to lose it and to let it spoil, but I am doing this, that it may grow forth again most beautifully, and bear and yield far more in return for this handful." Indeed, now it seems lost, scattered into the wind for birds and worms. But let summer come, and you will see it grow forth. One handful will grow into 10. One bushel will yield 6 others. Such are the peasant's thoughts. They do not dwell in the kernels which fall into the ground to rot. He does not think that they will remain in that condition. No, come. He looks forward to and awaits the coming summer, which will compensate him fully and in rich measure. He is so sure and certain of the growth of the grain, as though he already beheld it before him. Indeed, he is much surer of this than of what he here has in his hand. Otherwise, he would not be so foolish as to throw it away for no reason at all. And here's the last sentence, and listen to it. And so Luther writes, "The cemetery or burial ground does not indicate a heap of the dead, but a field full of kernels, known as God's kernels, which will verdantly blossom forth again and grow more beautifully that can be imagined." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.